A very warm welcome to everyone in our sixth technical session, Climate Financing for Sustainable Growth. The session will be chaired by Ajay Shankar, Distinguished Fellow TEDI. Panelists include C.K. Mishra, Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Climate Change, Government of India; Amar Bhattacharya, Senior Fellow, Brookings Institution; Ulka Kelkar, Director, Climate Policy, World Resource Institute; and there's going to be a video presentation by Naoki Yoshino, Dean, Asian Development Bank Institute, ADBI. Thank you very much. If I could request Ajay sir to please.
Well, let me welcome you. We are privileged to have a very distinguished panel today. In the theme today is climate financing for sustainable growth. The climate financing has been center stage. It's been a challenge. It's still a challenge. It's a work in progress, and obviously we need a breakthrough. But more than the larger canvas of climate financing, this session has a slightly narrower focus, and which is the issue of marine pollution and biodiversity holds considerable importance in this year's summit. Marine plastic waste negatively impacts on the ecosystems of the oceans and threatens marine biodiversity. The pollution of oceans eventually affects the health of the world population. This issue cannot be successfully addressed through the efforts of one country or developed countries alone. Hence, the cooperation, etc., is important. And then it is essential to extend measures to reduce, reuse, and recycle, and improve capacities in waste management internationally so as to contain marine litter and ocean plastic waste. In order to tackle these issues, the G20 leaders are encouraged to promote cooperation for preserving blue oceans. In this session, the focus will be on cooperation among G20 to lead the way on preventing marine pollution and conserving marine biodiversity, creating good circular economy, environment system, and private sector investments in such a global challenge. Now, personally, I am glad that the destruction of the seas has come center stage. I think this has been delayed. This should have happened much earlier, because there's this thing which you can see on YouTube, if a whale dies and the stomach and the whole body is just full of plastic. I had the experience of going to an uninhabited island in the Andaman Nicobars, and from the Southeast Asian side, when you went to the lovely sand, it was full of plastic, bottles, cans, including an old chappal. And the challenge of cleaning up all the oceans across the world is, I think, humongous, and the resources required would be enormous. So I'm very glad that it is center stage. And we will be discussing it, and the world will be taking it more seriously. We are privileged to have the Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Mr. C.K. Mishra. Apart from being secretary, he is also a friend and an outstanding individual and a very sharp mind. So with these words, may I request you to... And I will make a comment on his behalf. He may shy away from saying it, but there is a new government today. He'll have a new minister. So in case he has to leave early, we allow him to leave early.
The topic for discussion is very relevant, because all of us have been talking about the ill impacts of climate change on every aspect of life. I mean, whichever aspect you take, it's actually threatening life. There has been a lot of talk on climate finance, globally or domestically, and very little action on climate finance, particularly globally. And that is a point I would like to make today. That it is a story of commitments consistently not being kept. So that is something that will come in later. But what the chair was referring to in terms of marine pollution, etc., is a very relevant issue, and not just for the globe, particularly for India, for the simple reason that you have a coast of 7,500 kilometers. That's a huge, huge coastline. And when you talk about vulnerability of islands, etc., and the seas, we only think of island states. I mean, look at India. 1,300 islands. So you are as vulnerable as anyone else. And if this kind of a marine litter goes on happening, you have a problem. But then, marine litter cannot be isolated and separated from the entire gamut of climate change that is happening. It is critical. But you cannot have a separate kind of a resource-based activity only for marine litter. That you must is a different story. But this discussion, I think, if the chair permits, I mean, we can talk about these issues with reference to what is the resource that we have to tackle these problems, domestically or globally. First and foremost, let us accept one thing, that climate change is for real no matter what some people say in the world. And it's visible. Its impact in the last few years have been widespread in terms of floods, and floods in the most unlikely places in the globe. In terms of warming, when we come to warming, you look at the IPCC report. I mean, 1.5 of course is out of question. Even 2 is something that 2 degrees is something that is not happening. So we are in a piquant situation where the warming is going to go beyond 2 degrees centigrade. And if you really want to arrest this trend, you need resources. And if you take India, I mean, who is the worst sufferer of climate change? I mean, this is something that we need to really understand. That within the countries, it will be the most vulnerable countries, and within the population, it will be the most vulnerable population who will suffer because of climate change. And these are mostly countries and populations with scarce resources. Therefore, expecting that resources will be generated in-house is a mirage. It will not happen. And that is why globally an architecture was created, what is known as climate finance. There are many definitions to climate finance, and several justifications from multilateral agencies, bilateral agencies, and global major players of the developed world to say that a lot of climate finance is flowing. But before I begin on climate finance, let me tell you, climate finance must be adequate, predictable, and climate specific. It has to be an identifiable finance. Any kind of loaning or financing, everything that we do today in the world has something to do with climate change. Will have some impact on nature and resources. But you can't classify that as climate finance. So the point I'm trying to make is, unless it is unique and identifiable, climate finance will not happen. And given the current situation, there are 2 critical elements that we need to remember. Whether it is marine litter or it is sea rise or whatever it is, or agriculture being affected, there are 2 critical things that we need. First is resource, and the second is technology. And it was understood at the global level that to help countries overcome impact of climate change, these 2 things will be made available. Whether it was or not, we'll subsequently talk about it in a minute. And these 2 things are important because there are 2 specific aspects to how we are going to handle it. One is mitigation, and the other is adaptation. The whole world talks about finance for mitigation. There is very little discussion for finance on adaptation. A, not all can be mitigated, and B, that is not the only solution that is possible. Unless you fall back on adaptation, it is a very difficult thing, and India has been arguing at all international forum that we need to give adaptation the same kind of value that we give to mitigation today. Today, India is handling climate change impact mostly with its domestic resources. Now, domestic resources are limited. We know that public financing is very critical to handling climate change, but there is a limitation to public financing. Therefore, both global financing and private sector intervention becomes very critical when we talk about financing the climate. Now, for example, the marine litter. One of the critical elements of financing is the extended producer's responsibility that the industry has to face. Where is the litter coming from? It has to be recycled, go back. That is why we have a rule called the Plastic Waste Management Rule, which enjoins upon all the industries to have a EPR. But EPR requires investment, and private sector must invest. That is a finance which will directly mitigate the impacts of climate change. It's mind-boggling. We've done a preliminary estimation that if all the impacts of climate change were to be taken together, what did it look like? All industrial impacts, agricultural impacts and everything. What would it look like by 2030? The conservative figures are $2.5 trillion. All of us know this kind of finance is just not possible. Therefore, as a country, we need to prioritize as to what we need to do first, and globally, we need to think where the money must lie. And this is by 2030. As you go along, and this is a long fight, so as you go along, the resources required would be much more. So we have to look at this. Therefore, I feel that the role of international financing is very critical. But what was the promise? Let us look at the scenario of international financing. The promise made before 2020 was that the developed nations would make available at least $100 billion every year to assist countries in mitigating and adapting impacts of climate change. Now, the same countries are not even referring to what money they have given pre-2020. So pre-2020 has now stopped being a discussion, and this is the point that India has been making at international forums and all multilateral financing agencies, that look at pre-2020. You've made a promise, you don't want to fulfill that, and you want to have a dream for the future post-2020. This kind of a solution doesn't work. And if it's only to be discussed, it's fine. But if something has to happen, this is not the way that it will happen. And there is no firm commitment from anywhere. And you are aware that several countries are also dropping out of their old commitments. I don't want to name countries, but it's a fact. There's a withdrawal. While the agreement clearly says that it is non-negotiable, this point. So, how do we do it? What is the major fund available before the world? Let us say we want to do a project on plastic recycling. What is the major fund available in the world? It is the Green Climate Fund, the GCF. Now, if you look at the GCF, it holds today, and this is extremely, extremely sad, and total amount of 10 billion, of which only 5 is committed. So what do you do with this kind of funding? So we really need to think about where we are going. And it's been estimated at the global level that just in terms of basic infrastructure alone, global investment in low carbon energy may need to increase to 1.1 trillion, at least, per year between 2010 and 2030. So, and if you look at some of the key challenges that we are having in climate financing is that there is a huge mismatch between long-term assets and short-term credit provisions. As well as there is a huge shortage of attracting additional flows of international fund as well as private fund, not just in India, but across the globe. So this is a critical element that we need to discuss, and this is where the whole issue of G20 and other such bodies cooperating among themselves to find a solution becomes very critical. What was it that happened in COP24, for example? COP24 at Katowice. All countries again agreed that we have not done enough, so we'll do more, but we'll not discuss what we have not done, we'll discuss what we will do in future. And we will not give you a firm commitment of what we will do in future. So this is the way today globally we are looking at financing climate change across the nations. Technology, which is the second leg, is equally critically connected to the fund flow. There are two things in technology that we need to keep in mind, which is very critical to arresting impacts of climate change. The first aspect is free flow of technology. Unfortunately today, global technology is not flowing to where it should without barriers. Let us take one example. India. What are the hard to abate segments in India? Steel, cement. Now, steel, cement today does not have the technology to lower its emission to reduce the impact of climate change. Technology has to come from somewhere. But there are so many barriers and the expense of technology is so high that you are not able to get technology. Let us give one more example. Very simple example. You get these chips in namkeen all over in what is called the multi-layer packaging. I was surprised to learn that there is no alternative technology today in the world. And that is one of the biggest litter and pollutant today in India and elsewhere. There is no investment in research and development as far as climate change is concerned. Or if an investment has been made, barriers have been created so that the technology does not flow out. So how do you do it? These are issues which need to be discussed, because it's very easy for anyone to get up and say that these are the mitigation actions you must take to reduce the impact of climate change. But where will it happen from? And that is a critical question that we need to answer. And one sector in context of India where very little has happened is the private sector. As it is, the public funding has been low and the inflow from the private sector has not been enough. Therefore, there is a dearth and there is no R&D happening as well. The issue is that individual emissions may be low, and let me at this point also state that we are among the lowest emitters in the world today. Per capita emission of India is among the lowest. But being the fastest growing economy, in times to come, our emission levels is going to be the highest. Others have done it and closed their doors. They have used resources as they wanted, but closed the doors. It is our challenge. How do we use resources? Everybody talks about a no coal coalition. How can we survive in that scenario? We are still far away from where others are. And that will mean emission, that will mean further complication of impact of climate change. So as the growth story unfolds, our problems are not going to reduce, they are going to increase. Therefore, we need to plan for financing the impact reduction programs that we have. And one thing that I must say to the private sector and to those who write about it, it's not about emission from an industry or a vehicle or dust or whatever. It's at the end of the day about human life. So somewhere somebody has to act. And laws and regulations are aplenty. It does not matter how many laws and regulations you have. But if the will is not there, and more than the will, the acknowledgement that we have a problem on hand is not there, we will not be able to succeed. Therefore, the private sector and government need to come together in a big way, knowing fully well that you are not completely backed by global finance. And that is a complaint that as a country we have, that not keeping commitment goes against the norms of climate justice which we've been talking about. So, what do we do? The best option before us is what is being suggested today. Let groups like G20, etc., come together. If nothing else, at least share best practices and technologies. Finances may come, may not come. Even if we are able to share best practices and technology, that is a resource which is critical. So first and foremost, what I would suggest is that let such cooperation start with the creation of that resource which is easily givable and exchangeable. Once we are able to do that, I think we'll be able to create a climate where each country will be in a position to work out a plan for itself and perhaps implement it. It's extremely complicated, but at the same time, extremely critical that we do it. Thank you.
I now request Mr. Amar Bhattacharya, Senior Fellow, Brookings Institution. And thank you for very frank comments, and I think we need frankness and candor in these discussions.
Thank you. I'm going to actually connect a little bit the previous discussion to this discussion, and I will come back to some of the very critical issues that were raised by Secretary Mishra. And let me begin with a little bit of philosophy and saying, we've been living in the best of times and we are in the worst of times. The last 70 years have seen extraordinary human progress, not least in our own country. We have seen huge strides in terms of poverty reduction, huge strides in terms of life expectancy, in terms of health, in terms of well-being. So, a period of history like no other. But at the same time, it has put tremendous stresses on the natural environment, not just in terms of climate, but in terms of air quality, as we heard in the previous session, in terms of water resources, not just freshwater resources, but as we heard at the beginning, in terms of the oceans, and in terms of land, in terms of forests, and in terms of biodiversity. So it's been a growth path that has produced huge benefits at one level for mankind, but it threatens the very basis on which mankind exists. So that's my philosophical being, as it were, and we have to change that path. And what I will argue is that changing that path can actually produce a better growth. So that's going to be my central thesis, but finance and technology indeed are the key lubricants for bringing about that shift. Okay, so I have a four-part, and I'm going to run this really quickly. It's a lecture, and I want to leave these slides for people who are interested. But permit me if I go rather fast through this. So I want to talk about the first point, which is urgency and scale. which Secretary Mishra talked about. I want to highlight that. I want to talk about this possibility of a new era of economic growth, the central role of infrastructure, not just for climate, but for the SDGs more broadly. And then I want to come back to the issue of finance. And indeed, it's not 100 billion of finance that's the challenge. It's actually mobilizing trillions of finance for this endeavor. So we have these major milestone agreements. They have given us a new global agenda, the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to 2 degrees and ideally to 1.5, central element to it. The reality is, as Secretary Mishra said, despite the talk, we are far away from meeting the Paris agreements. To get to 2 degrees will be a major challenge. To get to 1.5 degrees at the moment seems near impossible. But it is that 1.5 degrees that I argue we have to aim for, especially because of the evident impacts of climate and growing spatial vulnerability. So the combination of that makes, as Secretary Mishra put, resilience and adaptation as a central challenge. If you look at the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, it's not trivial. We think about 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. Look at the incidence of extreme heat. Look at the frequency of rainfall extremes. Look at the average drought length. All of that will play out in the global map most intensely here in India. In any global climate map, the one country that stands out red in all these parameters is India. So it's not a trivial thing. And if we get a 2-degree temperature increase, or we would not have that in more than 1 million years. If we get 3 degrees, it will not have happened for more than 3 million years. And the last time that happened, the sea levels were 10, 20 meters higher than what they are right now. Okay? So the changes that will happen are actually going to happen in a once-in-a-history moment right in front of our eyes in our lifetimes. In the next 15 years, the stock of infrastructure will double in the world. In the next 20 years, the global economy will double. In the next 20 years, urban space will double in the world. And in the next 40 years, urban populations will double. These are once-in-history transformations, and they will determine whether humanity, in some sense, has a sustainable future or not. And if you think about it in carbon emission terms, a 2 degrees goal implies that carbon emissions have to be cut by 35% by 2030 on a path to net zero by 2070 or 75. A 1.5 degrees implies a 50% cut in carbon emissions by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. This is science-based targets. This is not economists on the one hand, on the other hand. These are science-based targets. Okay? So the next 2 decades, as I said, are critical, and we have to put ourselves on a path for sustainability in these 2 decades. But the good news is that actually we can think of a very different world, of the kind of world that Mr. Shankar and Mr. Mishra talked about, one based on a circular economy, one based on better resource productivity, one based on compact cities, on sustainable mobility, on better ecosystems. These are not costs, these are benefits. And we will reduce many of the costs that we have of the present growth model, which is congestion, pollution, declining health, failing ecosystems. That's the characteristics of the old growth model. And here's a report that, in one of my hats in the new climate economy I was associated with. I know Rajat is also part of this coalition. And the title of this report is Unlocking the Inclusive Growth Story of the 21st century and why climate action is actually an opportunity. Okay? And it's based on two fundamental drivers, and I'll just come to those quickly. But in a way, it's around the idea of innovation, high quality and sustainable infrastructure, greater resource productivity, and the vitality of the private sector. If we can harness this, we can make that shift. But the two key elements are very much, one is declining costs because of technology, much faster. If you look at these costs and you said 10 years ago, would this have been feasible? And the answer would have been no. You see that with LED lights here in India, as an example. Technology is moving much faster, and we heard that yesterday. And, it has a lot of risks and poses a lot of challenges, but in this area, it produces a lot of benefits. And the second is that the costs of climate action are growing much more exponentially than we thought in terms of extreme weather events. And the combination of extreme weather events and natural disasters and spatial vulnerability, that people are living in places that they shouldn't be living in, like the Jamuna floodplains, means that we are subjecting ourselves to much greater shocks. Okay, so I want to move to the next part, which is the central role of infrastructure. And infrastructure is the glue that connects growth, delivery of basic services, and environmental sustainability, including climate. If done well, it produces all the good things. If it done badly, as we have heard, if it is poor quality infrastructure, it leaves us with unsustainable debt, it doesn't produce the services, and it is extremely damaging for the environment. So the agenda on quality infrastructure that we heard before is indeed very important. The scale is very large. China and India will figure very, very prominently in this agenda. But let's not forget the advanced economies. I work very closely with the American Society of Civil Engineers, and believe me, the challenges in the US are just as daunting. I often tell people that the infrastructure in the US is actually in many ways third world. If you think about the rail network in the US, and I ask people as a quiz, what proportion of the rail network, the long distance rail network in the US is electrified, coming at it from this climate agenda, the answer is not 80% or 90% in Europe or near 100% as in Japan. The answer is 1%. So when you think about the transformation, the replacement of aging and polluting capital, that is an equally transformative challenge that afflicts the advanced economies. So the technology issue and the finance issue is not just an issue for emerging markets, it's also an issue for developed countries. These are the systems in which we have to make the changes: energy, cities, food and land use, water, industry, and transport, and as centrally pointed out, innovation. But despite all of this, we are actually not making much progress on infrastructure. We are not coming up with that rate of transformation, essentially because we are unable to translate, in some sense, the opportunities into realized demand, and we aren't able to tap these trillions of available savings into available finance. And the costs of the finance is way too high to produce the sustainable results. Here is a sketch of what needs to be done. It relates very much to the quality infrastructure agenda. I'm going to skip it. We need to tackle the market failures that are impeding, in some sense, resolution. The most important of that is the pricing of carbon. So here in India, we like to say that we have to use coal because we need to produce, electricity for our population. And as an Indian, I would say, yes, we need to produce electricity for our population, but coal actually is not very cheap. The capital costs of coal are very expensive, and if you take into account the pollution and the carbon costs, Like all economists, I would say, fine, produce it, just tax the externality. And we don't do that. So if you tax the externality, there will be very little incentive to produce coal here in India. Okay, let me end with the finance challenge. There are two characteristics of infrastructure that have not come out as strongly as it could. It has been mentioned. But one is that infrastructure produces value not for this generation, but for future generations. It is something that is very, very long term. And the second is the user that rides on the train or that on the road is only tapping a very small proportion of the benefit of the infrastructure. And the problem is we do not have revenue models that actually take into account these two elements. Very, very long-term revenue, and second, tapping the spillovers of infrastructure. Dr. Ishino, who will speak later on, will talk about the ways in which this can be done, but that is absolutely critical for sustainable infrastructure and climate-resilient infrastructure to be sustainable because of the nature of infrastructure finance. Second, while we think about the narrow aspect of climate finance, if we really want to finance this infrastructure, we have to bring all pools of finance effectively together. Domestic public finance, including municipal finance, as was pointed out. So much is happening at the municipal level, for example. International public finance, which has been largely missing in action, as Secretary Mishra pointed out, and I will talk more about that. But centrally, domestic and international private finance. And one of the problems of private finance is not just early stage finance, but actually long-term finance once the assets can be securitized. And for all of the talk of the NIIF, it's $3 billion. You know, the scale of what we are trying to talk about is in the trillions. So we really need to completely turn finance on its head. This is the public finance component. Think about urbanization, think about secondary cities, and think about these challenges in those Indian cities. We need a national urban strategy in India, as Rajat Kathuria has been arguing for. So I do think that this will be a very, very central part. I won't spend much time on the private sector part, except to say that the private sector can't expect double-digit rates of return in sustainable infrastructure. Sustainable infrastructure is a good bet, but if you expect double-digit returns, you will kill the viability of the project. So we have to bring down costs of capital in infrastructure, which means we need much better risk mitigation mechanisms than we have. I want to talk a little bit about the 100 billion commitment. So I want to reinforce that this is an extremely important commitment, and it has been largely a phantom commitment. Okay? Why? Because the components of this finance come from basically three sources. Grant finance from bilateral sources can be channeled through multilateral institutions. We'll come to that. MDB finance allotted to the developed country proportion of it, and the private sector mobilization through these two elements. If you take that definition, technically, you could perhaps by 2020 come up with the 100 billion. That's the numbers we come up with. But it would be flawed because the real need is for grant and concessional finance, and that hasn't grown at all. Indeed, the three critical needs of finance are for the Green Climate Fund, as was pointed out, for some maintenance and boosting of the climate investment funds because of the catalytic role they play, and a huge requirement for adaptation finance. And I'm hopeful that in the run-up to the UN Climate Summit and the One Planet Lab, which some of us have been working with President Macron, we will get some renewed focus on real delivery on these funds. But the important thing is not the 100 billion, but it is scaling up the billions into the trillions. And there I think the role of the multilateral development bank system and DFIs in general are not really well understood by policymakers, and it has not been supported well in the G20. And this is just in front of you a simple numerical calculation which shows that if you put 38 billion one time into the MDB system, you can double the capital base of those institutions. And with the trebling of lending that these institutions can do, they can indeed crowd in private finance that are in the trillions. But it is not being done essentially because the G7 have not seen it fit to expand the system. So my pitch to countries like India, and India is already very vocal about it, is really to see a major expansion of these institutions with a strong focus on sustainable infrastructure, blended with concessional finance, and pushing the kinds of agenda that Secretary Mishra laid out. There's also an agenda around what we call making the whole of the finance system sustainable. There's a little bit of skepticism here in India, included in the Reserve Bank. I think it's a good agenda, but we should not allow it to become a way to raise costs of finance. And I think the evidence is that it has not raised the costs of finance where it has been. And the last part of all of this is green finance. India has come late to the green finance business, but it is the fastest growing now here in India. It has huge potential and is a positive force. So I think there are three things that can help us right now. Relatively benign conditions, low interest rates in the world, rapid technological change. We have a global agenda that everybody agrees on. But unless the G20 really gets serious about this agenda, it will be very difficult to make the case for countries like India here at home and with others that it is able to pursue that agenda, just for its own benefit. This requires strong global attention. And because countries like the US and Australia, and I can name countries, sir, no problem about my naming countries, have stepped back, we are seeing a kind of a race now, which is not for the good, but for, in some sense, hiding a little bit behind the US. The one good thing is China remains extremely strong and supportive. Japan remains strong and supportive. India has remained strong and supportive. But we need to be able to get the G20 to lead, not just in terms of what the countries are doing, but delivering on the kind of financing commitments that Secretary Mishra had pointed out.
Thank you. I hope your persuasive abilities and eloquence has an impact in the right quarters. May I request Ms. Ulka Kirker from the Climate Policy World Resource Institute to.
Thank you very much. Should I use that? Which is the one? Thank you very much. So I work with a research institute called WRI India, World Resources Institute, and I work with the climate program here in India. Very eloquent presentations have gone ahead of me, so I'm at a bit of a disadvantage, but I'll try to hold your attention. This is a graph which is very popular and familiar to climate scientists, maybe not so much economists. It shows not the temperature rise, but how much carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere. And that's where it was the year I was born, and that's where it is, that's where it was when my daughter was born. And this kind of rise that has happened, it's taken these, this concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere to the highest ever level ever since human beings walked the face of the earth. So 800,000 years of Homo sapiens, and the carbon concentrations have never been so high. And why is it continuing to rise? My daughter is 10 years old now, and the graph just goes on steadily rising. So you've heard the figures before in the previous presentations. We are putting 50 billion tons of carbon dioxide in the global atmosphere, all the countries of the world put together, every year. And if we want temperature rise to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, in 10 years, we need to cut this by half, and by 2050, we need to make it zero, net zero, right? Now, 2050 is just 30 years from now. In 2050, my daughter, who's the one on the left, the taller one, she will be the age that I am today. So what does it mean to have net zero emissions in just 30 years? What it means is a major transformation. The IPCC 1.5 degree special report that was referred to earlier says that we need to increase the amount of investment going into renewable energy, low energy technologies, various kinds of technologies by a factor of 5. Another way of looking at it is that suppose there were no climate change happening, just want to have development, just want to build infrastructure of the sort that we need. The OECD estimates that this means that we need to invest $6.3 trillion in infrastructure every year from now till 2030. No climate change. What if you want to make this infrastructure climate proof or low carbon? What if you want to make it stand in a world with climate change? Would it cost a lot? Would it cost double, triple? It would cost only a fraction more. The $6.3 trillion figure per year becomes $6.9 trillion. The question now is, of course, as you know, has been talked about, where is this money going to come from? And this is a pretty picture. It shows different bubbles. India is doing very well. It's one of the larger recipients. But what doesn't stand out is these smaller island developing states, the ones you hear about always as being at the frontiers of climate change. And the reason why the money going to these sort of least developed countries and small island states is low is because a lot of this money, at least half of it, is loans, not grants. And the private sector contribution over here is also very fuzzy. So money is not going to go to adaptation, it's going to go to mitigation, where it has a result, a return in the form of energy or transportation. The numbers here are not very important. This is, the red line on top is that $100 billion goal that countries picked for themselves. And where we are now is still short of it. How much, if you see the faintest green bar on the top of, that's the mobilized private finance. Is this really accurate? We don't really know because of the way reporting happens. One of the decisions that was taken at COP24 was to have more clarity in the reporting. And when you go into the details, it's almost absurd. Because, for example, if you report climate finance on energy, you just report for the sector. This includes both renewable energy and also fossil fuel energy. You don't actually distinguish between the two. So now at COP24, the decision has been to at least report by subsectors. Similarly, it's all fine to report grants, loans, equity, but you also club in there insurance and guarantees. Again, one of the decisions that has been taken on reporting is to at least separate out some of this detail so that we know what money is actually going. The multilateral development banks, which are a major contributor to climate finance, we did an analysis which looked at, so every country in the Paris Agreement has a climate plan. It's called a nationally determined contribution. It's how much we would contribute, in what way we would contribute. The various multilateral development banks that are operating in various countries, only a quarter of the MDB investment strategies actually make reference to the NDC and explain how they will support the country's climate goals. The majority of them just pay lip service to this. It's the same, so another kind of a chart over here, it talks about, again, a major sort of new development, which is this Belt and Road Initiative, right? So China is coming. If you look at the first 2 bars, that's the investment in the fossil fuel industry. So that's upstream oil and gas extraction, coal mining. And the second graph is fossil fuel-based power generation. The amount of investment that is actually going into renewable energy is actually just a very small fraction. So it's about 13% of the investments in energy. Now, these MDBs have adopted a target of having at least a quarter of their investments going to low carbon energy. If the Belt and Road Initiative investments were also to take on that target, 25%, not 13%, this will infuse investment that is comparable, almost the same order of magnitude, to what MDBs are currently putting in. So it will be huge. Another thing that that these numbers actually tell you, that is, if you see who is investing in renewable energy in the Belt and Road Initiative, it's the private sector, the private-owned enterprises. The state-owned enterprises are tending to go for the fossil fuel energy. There are a couple of reasons for this. One is that the private-owned enterprises generally have smaller capital available, so they prefer to avoid the large-scale fossil fuel investments. And the other is that these cross-border kind of large-scale fossil fuel projects tend to have a lot of transactions costs. And so the state-owned enterprises, which also have their higher procedural requirements, prefer to go for these larger projects in order to recoup the transaction costs. So one of the principles that Dr. Bhattacharya referred to towards the end of his presentation is, then should we try to make all of finance climate sensitive, aligned with the Paris Agreement? And at the IMF World Bank Spring meeting in April 2019, one of the big announcements was this coalition of 20 finance ministers for climate action, and they adopted some principles. The first is to align policies and practices with the Paris Agreement commitments. The second refers to carbon pricing, which I'll come to in more detail towards the end of my presentation. The third says take climate change into account in macroeconomic policy in the kind of fiscal planning that you have. The fourth says mobilize private sources of climate finance. And the fifth says that try to engage more actively in the nationally determined contributions of your country. There's a sixth principle also, which I haven't mentioned over here. Now, some multilateral development banks have taken the lead and made these very strong announcements. The World Bank, for example, announced that in 2013 that in its energy sector, it will not invest in coal-based power plants except for rare circumstances. But there are always other pathways. So the International Finance Corporation, however, does invest indirectly in fossil fuel-based power projects through its intermediaries. The Norwegian sovereign fund was the latest to announce. It's $1 trillion. It was built on Norway's oil and gas wealth, but it's the latest to announce that it will exclude fossil fuel exploration and production companies in its investment profile. So that's quite a message. So the important thing to remember is that if you look at the kind of numbers that we're talking about with climate finance, it's a drop in the ocean when you look at the entire stock of global finance, which is $386 trillion as estimated by the IPCC. Even if MDBs are providing $35 billion in climate finance, triple of this is going to other activities. And if you look at the kind of money that's going into fossil fuel subsidies, that's $373 billion. So it's almost like you take away with one hand what you give with the other. The other development that's happening is what is being called financial disclosure. So with these California wildfires, one of the big litigations that happened was for PG&E, which was, it was held liable for not taking sufficient action despite knowing that wildfires are increasing because of the risk of climate change. So in some sense now, because climate risks are being seen almost as foreseeable, companies are being held to account for not taking preparatory action. So one of the things that they didn't do apparently was not spend the prescribed amount of money for putting their cable lines underground rather than above ground. So the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure was something that was announced in 2017, and already there are some 500 plus members and financial institutions which manage $100 trillion of assets. And this kind of reporting is actually mandatory in France. The important thing over here is that financial institutions as well as private companies are now being asked to disclose not only what the risks are because of climate change, but what their investments are in fossil fuel assets, which might become stranded if countries were to adopt more stringent climate policy. There are problems over here. For example, Indian agriculture, banks that give loans to Indian agriculture Does that mean that if they disclose that Indian agriculture is highly vulnerable to climate change, then something happens, their asset valuation goes down? So there are issues over here that one needs to be a bit careful about. The other way multilateral development banks, development finance institutions can play a role is by channeling funding where it isn't going otherwise. So there is the example of Africa, where solar home systems are being distributed and being paid for not in terms of an upfront capital cost, but through a pay-as-you-go model. And they draw inspiration from similar work that's been done in Bangladesh, where intermediary ITCOL was set up in order to channel development finance to set up more than 3 million solar home systems. And the way that this works is not only through providing finance, but also things like certifying vendors, setting standards, and so on. There was a reference also made to bonds, and in the morning also we talked about various kinds of infrastructure. So there are a huge number of bonds now coming out: blue bonds for oceans, green bonds, forest bonds, climate action bonds, climate awareness bonds, social bonds, and so on. So the external review and assessment of what assets and projects are actually being funded is quite crucial. Stock exchanges can provide enhanced visibility, but if you look at the green bond market right now, it's just less than 1% of the global bond market. The question to ask is climate finance actually spurring innovation? One thing is, the kind of trend that you saw with the solar prices falling, right? So you have technologies which are commercially available, and you try to incentivize the adoption of these by, say, renewable purchase obligations or subsidies or feed-in tariffs. And there are examples of how this is being done even in, say, for example, the green building sector, where you try to incentivize both builders as well as end consumers to adopt rooftop solar or energy efficient systems or green building practices. But the larger question is this spurring innovation where it is more difficult? So for example, energy storage or other forms of other sectors related to, say, fuel cell electric vehicles. And here, everything cannot be done through finance. There is a role for government policy of other forms as well. And so I'm going to end with this discussion of carbon pricing. And this picture is from the Yellow Vest protests in Paris. And the sort of interesting quotation there is that demonstrators complained that Macron was worried about the end of the world because of climate change, while they were worried about the end of the month and what it would mean for their paycheck, the kind of carbon prices that were being talked about, or the implications for their home heating bills and so on. So carbon pricing is a tricky issue. More than 40 governments around the world, national as well as subnational, have adopted some form of carbon pricing. It tends to be a little inadequate. I mean, we talked about pricing externalities and leveling the playing field. But the kind of prices that are currently being experimented with are less than $30 per ton of carbon. Private sector companies are also coming forward and adopting internal carbon pricing. Again, this tends to be low, around $10, $15 per ton of carbon. But there are ways in which you can do it right. So for example, British Columbia in Canada had a carbon pricing scheme which was a little higher than most. And the revenue that was collected was actually recycled and sent back to lower income households for paying their energy bills. Another way that is being done in the northeastern states of the US is that the revenue that is collected from the carbon pricing is invested in research and development on energy efficiency and renewable energy technologies. So there are ways of doing it right. But the larger question which the Yellow Vest protests raised is something that is now being talked about a lot in the context of climate change, which is that will the energy transition be a just transition? We're talking about shutting down coal-based power plants and bringing down emissions to net zero by 2050. What happens to the jobs that belong to these sectors? The new jobs that are coming in the green sectors, how do we make sure that we build the skills? How do we make sure that we provide the finance to entrepreneurs to take advantage of these? And how do we make sure that there are safety nets in place so that those who are affected do not find that this transition becomes a cause of greater injustice and difficulty than the original problem that we're trying to solve? So I'm going to stop there. Thank
Thank
you.
you.